Good evening. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove, and welcome to our 102nd step through the Bible. And we're getting to First Book of the Kings, the Wisdom of Solomon, which is essentially chapters 3 to 5 in the account of King Solomon. The person who's writing about King Solomon has really organized their material very well. So the first thing we have is his wisdom. Solomon the sage, as it's put in my Jerusalem Bible here in front of me. Now, if you just have a look at those chapters, you might ask you'll be able to formulate at the end and answer this question: in what consists the wisdom of Solomon? Because we've heard about the wisdom of Solomon, and we know he was a sage and he wrote down lots of wise sayings. And we know that the Queen of Sheba later comes and interviews him and asks him a lot of hard questions, and he's able to answer them. We're even told in the chapter 5 that Solomon was a bit of a scientist and a naturalist, so that he knew all about plants and he knew all about animals. In other words, Solomon was the sort of man who was a scholar and a gentleman. If ever you go to one of the most beautiful towns in Italy, that is, say, Urbino, which is a very small town but exquisitely beautiful, you'll go into the ducal palace, and in the ducal palace there's this amazing room which is quite small called the studiolo, the small study, and it's decorated with inlaid wood, and it's a sort of cabinet of the curiosities of the Duke of Urbino, who would sit there looking at his collections. And he'd have lots and lots of cupboards filled with lots of remarkable things, mineral specimens, animal specimens, and so on and so forth. And he'd know all about these things. In other words, he would be a collector, a naturalist, a scientist, and visitors would come and they would look at his collections and they would go away amazed. And I think the same is true of King Solomon. He was that sort of person. He was a a it's hard because these people don't really exist anymore to say what he was. He was a sort of not a mad professor, but rather a somebody who was a bibliophile, a lover of knowledge, an amateur philosopher, and indeed a real philosopher. Because later on, all sorts of bits of Jewish philosophy, which were any good, were all attributed to Solomon. And all bits of Jewish poetry that were any good were attributed to Solomon. So, oh, it's good. Oh, it must have been written by Solomon. Or if we want to make out that this is good, we attribute it to Solomon. But actually, the wisdom of Solomon, well, what was it? Well, first of all, it came from God. That's the first thing. He has this dream. God says, ask what gift you want. And he said, I'm young. I ask for a wise and discerning heart. And God says, you've done well to ask for that rather than victory in battle and more superficial things like that. And because you've asked this, I'll give you wisdom of heart and I'll give you everything else as well. Um, a complete reversal, incidentally, to the judgment of Paris, if you remember from the Trojan War. Paris just asked for the world's most beautiful woman. Paris was superficial, wasn't he? Whereas Solomon would never have made that mistake. Although, as it turns out later, we'll see, not so much. Anyway, and then we have this parable or this story about the baby and the two prostitutes and the cutting of the baby in half and done, illustrating the wisdom of Solomon. Many people say, yes, Solomon, really, really clever. He provides he gets the root of the problem. He's got this test, tell who's telling the truth. Yes and no. The real point of the story about cutting up the baby and who is that Solomon is a dispenser of justice. Solomon is a lawgiver and an administrator of law and a fair judge and the one who gets the truth, one who in each lawsuit works out the truth of the matter and makes sure that the person who is in the right has that is treated as such and is not, there's no miscarriage of justice. Now, when you consider miscarriages of justice are very common, even today, therefore, Solomon's judgment, his sense of being able to decide a court case, is exemplary and is praiseworthy. But the judgment of Solomon gives way to something else in these chapters, and that is the wisdom of Solomon is seen in his administration. Now, administration is a rather boring topic. But the truth of the matter is, we're told, for example, in chapter 4, we're given a list of King Solomon's officials. Now, say, for example, Azariah, the son of Zadok, was a priest, Elim, etc., and so on and so forth. Um, Zabud, son of Nathan, was the friend of the king, presumably sort of prime minister. Ahiashar was master of the palace. Eliab, son of Joab, commander of the army. Adoram, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor, the ministry of labor. In other words, Solomon created a government. Solomon created a civil service. Solomon created an administration. Now, and then he had all these 12 men, each one had 1 month and so on. Solomon, and this is the key word which comes again and again, was organized. And these administrators, we're told, chapter 5, provided the food for Solomon and all those who admitted him at the royal table, each for a period of months. In other words, and they provide for all the animals as well. There were all these horses, there were all these other animals, they were all fed at the right time. Um, um, the daily provisions for Solomon were 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, and so it goes on. In other words, Solomon sets up a system, and it's a system that works. Now, we all live in some sort of system, but the vast majority of us on this planet live in a system which simply doesn't work. I've lived in a variety of countries. I've lived in England, I've lived in Wales, I've lived in Malta, I've lived in Italy, and I've lived in Kenya. And so, trust me, I know something about systems that simply don't work. One of the things about Solomon's judgment is he's impartial between the two women. And presumably his system is logical and impartial. Whereas in many countries today, the system is not impartial. The system serves to raise up one group at the expense of another group. This is true. It's true in Kenya, it's true in Malta, it's true to a large extent in Italy. And therefore, because the system is skewed towards one particular group, irrespective of their talents, because of whose friends they are and so on, as a result of that, the system is inefficient and, it has to be said, the system is hated. I used to have lots of conversations with my students in Africa about what made a third world country because they didn't really understand this concept of the third world country, even though they were all told constantly they were by people from outside Kenya, they were living in a third world country. As a matter of fact, it's a rather unfair designation because Kenya is an extremely successful country compared to many of the countries around it, and it has succeeded hugely over the last 50 or 60 years in a way that other countries have not. It's had massive challenges, but it's answered many of those challenges. A third world country, I said to them, is one in which people hate the police. Simple. And that is, I don't think that's the only thing about a third world country, but it is the number one thing about a third world country. It is, if you like, the tip of the iceberg with a third world country. Why do you hate the police? Because the police are not fair. Why are the police not fair? Because first of all, they're always soliciting bribery. Secondly, they don't like you if you come from the wrong side of the tracks. So, for example, in Italy, many Southerners hate the police because they see the police as corrupt and the agents of a corrupt government. Many Northerners in Italy hate the police because they see the police as fat, lazy, stupid state beneficiaries who come from the other side of the tracks, namely the south of Italy. So the police in Italy, amongst some people, not all, are hated, it has to be said. Whereas, of course, one of the things that marks out Britain until fairly recently was the fact we all loved our policemen until fairly recently. There have been one or two knocks to that reputation in the last 50 years. Now, the point about Solomon is he's created this beautiful system that seems to work for everybody. And we're told right at the end, um, Judah and Israel, because don't forget they're sort of a twin kingdom, lived in security, everyone under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, throughout the lifetime of Solomon. Judah and Israel were numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate and drank and were happy. So, in other words, what flourishes under Solomon, um, glorious as he is the common good of the ordinary people. Though, in other words, Solomon's glory works for everybody because Solomon is a fair administrator and who's created a fair system. Now, that is what the wisdom of Solomon is: creation of fair system, creation of a system that benefits everybody, and creation of the administration of a system which works. In other words, all the animals are fed on time. The greatest achievement of Solomon, what was it? The temple? No, not really. The fact that all the animals got fed on time. In other words, things worked. Wouldn't it be lovely if we all lived in countries where things worked? King Solomon has got a lot to teach us. All the best. Bye.